A movie turning into a TV show. This is nothing new, but it's happening more and more these days, and there's one that's come out recently that's so crazy, so different, and so much fun that I can't stop talking about it. And that is Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Now, before we get into this wild show, let's get into a brief history of films getting adapted into TV shows. This has been happening basically since TV shows could have a budget. Just like sequels have changed their look throughout the years, movies have been forever getting adapted into TV shows, especially hit movies that have resonated with audiences. Some of the most famous TV shows throughout the decades have been based on movies, and the first big notable one is MASH. MASH the movie came out in 1970 and was directed by Robert Altman, who's considered even today to be one of the great filmmakers. MASH stands for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, and the movie stars the late great Donald Sutherland as well as Elliot Gould as two surgeons stationed at a MASH hospital during the Korean War. The movie focuses on not just their surgeries, but also just the antics and the things they get onto with other surgeons, guests, even rival army hospitals. Though it was set in the Korean War, it was a satire about what was going on in Vietnam, and it was considered a comedy very ahead of its time. It was considered a terrific and bright, clever sort of satire. It's a very enjoyable movie. It also won an Academy Award for writing. The movie resonated with audiences so much that only 2 years after it came out, its impact continued. MASH the series came out in 1972, only 2 years later, and ran for 11 seasons. And it starred Alan Alda as Hawkeye, who was previously played by Donald Sutherland in the movie. So the show is based on the exact same characters and the same story as the movie, and is expanding that concept into a long-form series. It's taking the same book as the source material, but erasing the movie from the canon and adapting that same story that's now been popular from the film into a long-running series. It even used the same theme song that the movie made popular, which is a song called Suicide is Painless, which was actually written for the opening credits of the movie. Of course, MASH was incredibly popular throughout its run, and one could say that it was definitely not in the shadow of the movie by the time it ended, and Alan Alda, who led the show over so many years, can definitely be considered, looking back, as big of a part of the MASH legacy as Donald Sutherland or Elliot Gould would be considered. Another really popular and impactful series is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I didn't know that this was based on a movie until recently, but Sarah Michelle Gellar definitely is more recognized as pop culture's Buffy than the actress who played her in the movie. And again, this is based on the same storyline with those same characters and names from the film, but expanding on that in a long-form series as helmed by Joss Whedon when it came out. So far, this has been pretty straightforward. The approach is straightforward. It's adapting the same storyline, the same characters, just seeing what it would look like with a TV series with multiple episodes and even seasons. But now let's talk about shows that take very different approaches to adapting a popular film. Let's start with Friday Night Lights. The movie Friday Night Lights is based on a book that's inspired by true events, which is the 1988 season of the high school Permian Panthers. And Billy Bob Thornton, who plays his football coach Gary Gaines, this is a real person, as is Derek Luke's star player in the movie. And the show doesn't take a very different approach to this story, except it's not based on a true story. The characters are not the same. It's no longer based on this true story. What it is capturing the essence of the movie. You have those same character archetypes, the same dynamics, similar settings, but the names are changed. It's no longer real life characters. Kyle Chandler is playing an inspirational football coach, similar to Billy Bob Thornton's character. There's a star player who suffers a career-ending injury, but the show isn't interested in adapting the story of the book, rather adapting the vibes. It's taking those dynamics that resonated with people in the Peter Berg movie and exploring them in a deeper way that audiences can experience for longer. So like I said, this show isn't interested in capturing the exact story, but rather those vibes and something that's true to the movie, even though it's not that same true story. Now, before we get into the more modern film TV adaptations, let's stop and ask, why are these made so often? Well, the same reason a sequel or a ride or a video game is made to a successful, recognizable movie. Turning a popular movie to a TV show is part of making a franchise. You're able to take an audience that's been established and then bring them to the small screen. People are excited to see something that they like explored over a longer period of time and over seasons as well, which are easier to greenlight than a theatrical sequel to a successful movie in many cases. Which is why the sequel continuation series is, I think, a lot more popular these days. For example, Ash vs. the Evil Dead or Cobra Kai. They're easier to greenlight and don't have to rely on box office returns rather than streaming views in order to be considered successful. And we get this a lot these days. For example, the Full Monty series on Disney Plus or the Willow series on Disney Plus. And we're seeing this a lot now because it's a lot easier to put something on a streaming service and take advantage of a brand that way. Even more so, Marvel is to blame with every single franchise wanting a TV series now, even if they can get sequels as well. Not only do we have WandaVision and Loki, we have Peacemaker, we have The Lord of the Rings of Power, even Knuckles the Echidna from Sonic has his own TV show. Isn't that kind of wild? The 2020s has entered us into this culture where basically every successful movie or franchise needs a TV series now in order to be considered big and relevant. And I don't blame them. It's successful. More seasons are easy to produce because they only take a year or two to release as opposed to 2 to 4 years for a sequel to a movie. And I want to acknowledge all of these shows, even though I want to talk more in this video about the shows that aren't canon to their films and vice versa. What else is a big one? Let me think. Oh, Fargo. Fargo is one of my favorite TV shows like ever. And it does this by, again, recapturing the vibes that made the show great rather than recapturing the exact characters. Marge Gunderson, who Frances McDormand won an Oscar for playing in the Fargo movie, is nowhere to be seen in the show, but her essence is very much felt with characters like Molly Silverson in the first season or Gloria Burgle in the third season. Fargo is an adaptation in the way Friday Night Lights is. It doesn't care about taking those same characters that were in the movie. Rather, it tries to capture those same feelings we felt watching the movie. Like the American Midwest being this cold, dark, endless place of secrets and crime, or death and violence being something ironic and humorous, and justice being a form of often randomness. And it's managed to brilliantly expand on its source material by completely setting itself free. I mean, we're 5 seasons in, and people are still arguing if the new season is as good as the first. That's how good Fargo is. I'll admit the 4th season is not very good, but seasons 1 to 3 and 5 are pretty magnificent. Another example is Westworld, another one of my favorite shows of all time, which again is only taking the main concept from the original movie. And Yul Brynner's character of the gunslinger is slightly adapted into Ed Harris's character of the Man in Black, but it's really just the archetype and appearance and not the essence of the character at all. It really is just taking the story of a futuristic park set in the Old West in which the hosts or robots look like characters from the Old West and people come to interact with them, and really expands on that from there. The characters of Dolores and Maeve, who are played by Evan Rachel Wood and Tandy Newton, are completely new to the show and not at all rooted in something from the movie. After the first episode, the show completely ditches its source material and just takes off from there. It's a brilliant creation, this show, and one of the most tense, mind-boggling shows I've ever watched. It's very Game of Thrones-like in its pace and the amount of characters, even if seasons 3 and 4 kind of missed the landing. And one more before we get into this year is What We Do in the Shadows, which again stands neck and neck with its film counterpart for, being beloved and having a say in the legacy of its namesake. What We Do in the Shadows, the movie, came out in 2014, and it was directed by and stars Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement. It follows 3 vampires living in New Zealand and kind of just the things they get on to. And the show is very much the same thing, except it takes a new batch of characters and sets the show in Staten Island rather than in New Zealand. And it takes a very sitcom-esque approach to these situations that the vampires get into, and it's now run for 5 seasons. It's a concept that worked brilliantly in the movie, but also fits the series format like a glove. So now let's get into this year, 2024. There are 2 shows based on movies that have become really popular. popular, and two of the most entertaining shows of the year so far. First up is The Gentleman. This property had a very quick turnaround. The movie came out in early 2020, right before the pandemic hit. It became a box office success. It had an all-star cast, and again, the show, Guy Ritchie originally said it was a spin-off, but considering it has no references to the movie, it's not necessarily confirmed if the movie's canon to it or not, but it does a really strong job of adapting the feel of the movie while bringing you a completely new setting, a new batch of characters, a new lead to root for. It is still a raunchy crime thriller comedy with death everywhere, arrogant, crazy characters, and funny crime-esque situations. I really enjoyed The Gentleman, and I think Theo James makes for a really excellent protagonist here, just as Charlie Hunnam did in the first one, even though it's not trying to copy anything that the story of the movie did, except for the whole weed production thingy. So yeah, The Gentleman is a movie that I really enjoyed and was excited when I heard about this show, even though I thought it was completely unnecessary. When I heard Theo James, Kaya Scodelario, and Giancarlo Esposito were in it, I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot, and I'm really glad to say how much I enjoyed it. But there's one show that I think defies all categorizations that we've been talking about. It's one of the best shows of the year, by far. It's ballsy, it's awesome, it's creative, and doesn't really care to reference or even feel like it's movie at all. And that's Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Yes, the Brad Pitt Angelina Jolie movie directed by Doug Liman. If you don't remember, the movie came out in 2005. It stars Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie as this married couple who are also spies who have been hired to take each other out. And honestly, the movie kind of sucks. It's really boring for an action movie. The action scenes are kind of lifeless. You know, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie are definitely charismatic, but none of the story or the progression of the runtime really interested me at all. And it really shocked me how boring this action movie could be. So yeah, I might get some hate for not liking the Mr. and Mrs. Smith movie. It was a huge hit at the box office. It does have its fans, but I haven't talked to anyone who passionately adores it or something. So I think I'll be okay. So yeah, I had really no plans to start this show just cause like I had a feeling it was probably just going to be similar to the movie, and the same concept being, you know, expanded into a show sounds fun but doesn't sound like a must at all. And I'm very picky with my shows because if I'm going to dedicate 8 or more hours to a series, I have to be really engaged and really just in love with the show that I'm dedicating myself to. And I knew even without watching it that the show was going to be better because Donald Glover was in the front seat. But again, having not liked the movie, I just didn't feel like I was gonna, you know, commit 8 hours to a show that was probably gonna be just a fun action show. But then I found out that Donald Glover is also one of the creators of the show, and that he and Hiro Murai, who he's worked with on shows like Atlanta and Swarm, which I love both, were actually creative heads around the entire series. So that immediately convinced me, not to mention I heard some Emmy buzz going around, so I was like, okay, maybe I'll give it a shot. And I watched the first episode and I was immediately blown away. Because despite how popular that movie is, the show immediately ditches everything that's popular about the movie. If this show was going to be an action comedy the way the movie was, I thought it was going to be something along the lines of Red Notice or Ghosted, which is why I initially thought I could skip it. But it's actually something a lot more similar to Barry. In this dark, ironically humorous assassin world. It's no longer this showy big action spy comedy the way the movie is. It's rather this patient crime romantic thriller about a man and a woman who are married and they're spy assassins and just their dynamics and the different situations they're going through. And it's very funny, don't get me wrong, it's hysterical, but not in that same crowd-pleasing way that the movie is. The visual aesthetic is absolutely terrific. The aesthetic and the score gives this Severance vibe, which is not even something the movie alludes to at all. And the chemistry that Donald Glover and Maya Erskine share on the screen is something that I can only call electric. Glover is hilarious, sarcastic, brilliant as always. Maya Erskine's performance is kind of magical. Her charm and the way that, you know, she plays into this dynamic that they have, I just love them so much in this. And I don't think Pitt and Jolie would have been able to, even though they're so talented, would have been able to pull off what Glover and Erskine do in this show. There's plenty of celebrity cameos, there's different deadly situations that they get into, there's blood, there's innuendo, there's raunchiness to it. It doesn't play it safe, and that's what I absolutely love about Mr. and Mrs. Smith. It kept making me want to click and click every time I finished an episode on Amazon Prime, and I cannot commend it enough for this awesome experience that it gave me without playing it safe or sticking true to its movie beyond just the log line, which is there's this couple, they're married, and they're spies. And that's one of the reasons that it resonated and latched onto me so much. It's the antithesis of the movie. It's not this safe, big action franchise project the way Amazon has done it with Jack Ryan or Reacher. It's the opposite. It's rather what they've been doing with Swarm, or what HBO did with Barry, or what Apple TV did with Severance. It took someone like me who hated the Mr. and Mrs. Smith movie, didn't care for it at all, and made me an avid fan. As I'm filming this, they haven't decided yet if they're bringing the same couple back for season 2, but whatever they do, I am now a fan. And this is one of my favorite shows of the year so far, and I can't see that changing anytime soon. So we've covered a lot of great TV adaptations of movies that, in order to retain their film fan base for a longer period of time, over multiple seasons even, have tried to recapture the essence of the movie, but Mr. and Mrs. Smith does the exact opposite of what we talked about before and reinvents the film to TV adaptation, actually thus becoming one of the best ever. By the way, don't get me started on all these mid-tier network film to TV adaptations. They racked out so many, especially in the 2010s, that I can't even count them. Not even just the Terminator, Sarah Connor Chronicles, but more recently, they did a Minority Report show, which sounds like a brilliant idea, but I heard was pretty bad. There's a Shooter TV show with Ryan Felipe, a Lethal Weapon show with Damon Wayans, and did you guys know there's a Training Day series with Bill Paxton? Like, doesn't that sound kind of fantastic? But I heard they completely fumbled the bag with that one. Anyway, thanks for watching this video about film to TV adaptations. I hope you got at least one TV recommendation out of it, or you found a movie and a show to watch. And please, please, please watch the Mr. and Mrs. Smith series, no matter what your feelings are on the movie. Even skip the movie if you haven't seen it and watch this fantastic show. And let me know if there's any great TV shows based on movies that I missed in the comments.